And I want to welcome you to our ongoing Black History series, Black History Month speaker series. This is a series of free interactive online talks by presenters from around the province who will share stories on many subjects related to both Black history in New Brunswick and the present-day Black community here. This includes talks on subjects ranging from Black Loyalists and refugees, famous Black firsts in the province, entrepreneurship, personal uplift, and even poetry reading. So today's presenter has a research specialty that works out quite well for us. It's Black Loyalists. He is the contributor to the Dictionary of Canadian Biography, the author of Birchtown and the Black Loyalist Experience, 1775 to the Present, which is an illustrated book telling the story of Nova Scotia's Black Loyalists and the Birchtown settlement. And he is also the author of Black Loyalists in New Brunswick, the lives of 8 African Americans in colonial New Brunswick from 1783 to 1834. We're honored to hear from him twice this week, today, and he'll be returning this Friday, February 19th at 11 a.m. Today he'll tell us about 5 Black Loyalists who decided to make their home in New Brunswick. Please welcome historian Mr. StephenDavidson. Stephen, how are you?
Hi, Damon. Great.
Good deal. Stephen, we want to hear your about your research on these Black Loyalists. So I think a good place to begin talking about them would be to define a Black Loyalist. How is a Black Loyalist different from a Black refugee, and how did they get to New Brunswick?
Yeah, well, the term Black Loyalist actually was only coined in the late 1960s. Before that, in the historical documents, they are referred to as Black refugees, or in a petition that Black Loyalists sent to the New Brunswick government, they called themselves the Free Blacks of the province of New Brunswick. Mm-hmm. But the term is recognized as a historic fact. Any patriot slave during the American Revolution was granted his or her freedom if they crossed over into the British lines. And that happened between 1775 and 1782. The British issued 3 different proclamations offering freedom to the slaves of patriots. The British were not acting out of humanitarian concerns. They weren't abolitionists. They basically wanted to destabilize the patriot economy. And one way to do that was to free the patriot slaves. So of course, this offer of freedom was not offered to someone who actually supported the crown. White loyalists did not have their slaves freed by the British government.
Exactly.
So, it had an ulterior motive, but it freed thousands of people. In fact, the number of Black Loyalists probably goes into the tens of thousands during the American Revolution. Number of them died during the Revolution. Smallpox was really bad.
Wow.
They would die in service. Not all of them came to what is now Canada. Some, besides settling in the Maritimes and Ontario, some went to Germany. 5,000 went to Great Britain. Some went to the West Indies. But what would characterize all of those Black Loyalists, no matter where they went, was that they did cross the British lines. Yeah. Most of them used their freedom to serve the crown during the Revolution. And in 1782, they were issued certificates to validate the freedom that they'd been given by the British government. And so they left the United States, for the most part, with a certificate in hand saying that they were free men and women. About 4,000 Black Loyalists settled in the Maritimes, and that works out to about 1 in 10 of all Loyalists that came to the Maritimes. We don't know the exact number of Black Loyalists that settled in New Brunswick, because when they came in 1783, New Brunswick was just the northwestern part of the colony of Nova Scotia.
Right.
And so it's a little harder to delineate. However, there was probably around 1,300, 1,400 Black Loyalists that settled in New Brunswick. And the reason that they came to New Brunswick and Nova Scotia was that the maritime colonies were the closest to the rebellious 13 colonies. The British paid for Loyalist refugees, both white and Black, to be transported to Nova Scotia. Mm-hmm. the British needed loyal settlers to settle in Nova Scotia because, in the future, perhaps the 13 colonies, the new United States could take over New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. So they needed loyal settlers. It was close at hand. It's only a 2-week journey by sea from New York, where most refugees departed. So it's where most white loyalists came, and so it ended up being where most black loyalists came as well.
Sure. It's interesting. Just in my in my sort of travels around St. John, I've encountered plenty of people with the surnames. Well, Stackhouse is one, and Holder is another. And people in the St. John region will know those surnames from various people. But I've talked to them, and I found that they're actually from those loyalists were actually families from around where I'm from, which is southeastern Pennsylvania. I believe the Holders were from Lehigh, the Northampton in Northampton County, which is just north of the Philadelphia area, and then the Stackhouses are from Bucks County, which is just northeast of Philadelphia. So I find it fascinating. It's like living an alternate reality from the stuff that I grew up around.
Yeah. It's the whole loyalist refugee experience is kind of the untold story of the American Revolution.
Exactly. That's
Yep.
That's a great way to put it. In your book, Stephen, you write about 8 people actually, 5 loyalists who stayed in New Brunswick, and then 3 who left for Sierra Leone, and of course we'll discuss them on Friday. But you talk about Thomas Hyde, who I guess was the first black loyalist to arrive in New Brunswick. Can you tell us a little bit more about him?
Yeah. He had the fortune to be an employee of a loyalist named Filer de Blee. And that gentleman was on the very first ship that sailed into St. John Harbor with loyalist refugees. The ship was called the Union, and it arrived on May 11th, 1783. And the manifest for that ship is actually in the New Brunswick Museum. And it lists the loyalists, the head of the household. It lists their wives, their children, and if they had any servants come with them.
Yeah.
And all that's on that manifest is the fact that there were 2 servants on the Union, and that tells us very little. This is kind of typical for how you start with Black Loyalist studies.
Yeah.
And servant was very often a euphemism for a slave. People didn't like to come out and say what the status of a person. But thanks to the Book of Negroes, which is a ledger compiled to keep track of black loyalists and enslaved blacks, we know that those 2 people on the Union were a 27-year-old young man named Tom Hyde and a 9-year-old girl named Suki. So they were free. They were not slaves. Tom Hyde escaped from slavery in 1778. And then for the next 5 years, he was on Long Island, where he worked with the British, and he acquired a certificate known as a Birch certificate. Okay. It indicated that he was a free man, free to go wherever he wanted within the British Empire. They usually, opted for the Maritimes. So Tom comes as an employee. He's not a slave. He's not an indentured servant. He is an employee of a white loyalist, and so he is among the 209 passengers on that very first ship. If we were more like Americans, we'd be celebrating the Union the way Americans celebrate the Mayflower, because this is the ship that brings that first fleet into St. John's Harbor. Yeah. So Tom is an employee of de Blee, but within a year, his employer dies by suicide. And so Tom is no longer employed. However, there are a number of other black loyalists in St. John. A lot of them settled over in what is now West St. John. It was known as Carleton back then. Okay. And Tom and 11 others petitioned the New Brunswick government to get some land up on the Belle Isle Bay, which is a tributary of the St. John River. Right. What strikes me is that immediately, as soon as black loyalists come to New Brunswick, they take advantage of the system, just like the white loyalists knew how to work the system to acquire land and the black loyalists step right into this. They embrace being citizens of the British Empire. They are not reluctant to claim the land that they were promised.
Sure.
When Patriot slaves were given their freedom, the British said that they would be given land later on. So, Tom steps right up to that. The unfortunate,
which only makes sense.
What's that?
Which only makes sense.
Yeah. Now, the sad thing is the settlement in Belle Isle, for unknown reasons, didn't take. It did not last. And if we look at the map that we have from 1787, when we look at the Belle Isle area, there is no indication that are any black settlements there, although there are black settlements further down on the Kingston Peninsula and around the Nerepas River. So for whatever reason, that settlement by 12 heads of households didn't work out. Okay. And that's where we lose track of Tom. We only can kind of keep our hand on where black loyalists went, given the documents of the era. So right. Thanks to a ship's manifest, the Book of Negroes, and a petition found in the archives in Fredericton, we can piece together a little bit of Tom's story. Okay,
interesting. You mentioned a John Patterson. He was an indentured servant. What became of John Patterson once his indenture was completed?
Yeah, John was a teenager as the Loyalists are leaving from New York. He's only 15 years old. He was born free, mixed race, and he's got to figure out, okay, how am I going to cope? How am I going to survive? And he took advantage of a system that was used by the white population in the colonies for decades, and that was to indenture yourself. And what that meant is that you basically sign over so many years of your life to someone, and in return you get fed, you get shelter, you get clothing. Sometimes you are trained in a trade, and at the end of the set time, you are once again your own person. Mm-hmm. The only people that could enter into indentures were free people. So we have black loyalists, about a dozen, come to New Brunswick as indentured servants, but they are still free people because only free people can become indentured servants. This was one way that the 13 colonies were colonized, that poor people in England would indenture themselves to people in the New World. Right. And we have an indenture record of a young lady in St. John that entered into that kind of contract before the Loyalists arrived. So if you will, it was the social safety net for some people. It was one way to make sure that you had a job and that you're going to be fed. So John Patterson comes to New Brunswick with a Brooklyn tavern keeper. The fellow's name is Charles Loosely. And they arrive in June of 1783. They set up a tavern in St. John. It gets burned down in one of the fires. So they move to Shelburne, which is the one of the largest settlements in all of North America, settled by Loyalists. And this is going to bring John into contact with the largest black free black settlement in all of North America, in Birchtown. Right. However, Charles Loosely doesn't stay in Shelburne. For whatever reason, he moves back to New Brunswick and sets up shop in Gagetown. And as far as we can tell, that's where John Patterson finished off his indenture. He would have been waiting on tables, looking after guests in Gagetown. We next pick up on him when he's 46 years old. So we jump in the documents from his teenage years to being 46. Okay. And he's farming just outside of Fredericton by that point. So
this is the early 19th century.
Yeah, 1814. He's farming outside of Fredericton. And at this point in time, the most wanted man in New Brunswick is a fellow known as Henry Moore Smith. And he was guilty of horse thieving and was going to be hanged in Kingston, New Brunswick, but he gets out of jail. Yeah. And it turns out Smith hides in John Patterson's barn and sneaks into Fredericton at night to steal things, comes back and hides again in Patterson's barn.
Is that right?
Yeah. And John is just a little bit suspicious. He comes across this white guy in his barn and, what are you doing here? And Smith says, oh, I'm sorry. I was coming here to buy some land. Hope you don't mind that I'm in your barn. Patterson leaves him be, but he's suspicious because there were a lot of people deserting from the War of 1812 at this time, and he thinks maybe he's got a deserter in his barn.
Sure.
So he gets a posse together. They capture Smith, takes him into Fredericton, and he finds out, lo and behold, he's the most wanted man in New Brunswick.
Oh, is that right?
And the sheriff, Walter Bates, comes up from Kingston. They chain Smith to a boat, and Patterson is in that boat with Walter Bates and Henry Smith as they go down river back to Kingston to have Smith put away in jail. Mm-hmm. And John gets $80. So he gets that reward money. And this story would be lost entirely if Walter Bates hadn't decided to write about this crazy Henry Moore Smith. There's a lot more to his story, and Bates thought that people would be interested in it. So he wrote a book called The Mysterious Stranger in 1817. This book becomes the first bestseller on both sides of the Atlantic and in the United States ever to be written by a Loyalist by a New Brunswicker.
Is that right?
And in that book, we have the reference to John Patterson. So John pops up in the Book of Negroes because he's an indentured servant traveling to the New World.
Right.
To New Brunswick. He captures the most wanted criminal in New Brunswick in his day, and so he ends up in this book. Mm-hmm. The last time that we find Patterson is in 1833, and it's just a small reference in a newspaper to the fact that he had sought shelter overnight in a home in Fredericton. And while he's sleeping by the fireplace, he catches fire, and they find him dead the next morning. So it's a sad ending to a life that actually put him into the international spotlight. But it's an interesting life in that as we follow him, we follow the first 50 years of Black Loyalist history in New Brunswick. So
sure, and you have him as a teenager, you have him farming in his 30s, and then unfortunately dying in his 60s, in the 1830s. So we have Bates's book, which mentions Patterson, but otherwise it seems like he lived a rather quiet life. So how do you discover Loyalists? How do you discover stories of Black Loyalists who led quieter lives?
Yeah, and it's a problem right across the board for Loyalists in general. It's people that make the headlines that do something stupendous or notorious that get in the news. What is helpful in doing this research is that the Book of Negroes is a great starting point, the ledger compiled by the British government, because it gives us the age of the person, it gives us their legal status, it says where they were enslaved, how long they served with the British, the ship that they came on. White Loyalist descendants would give their eye teeth for the kind of information that's in the Book of Negroes. It's an amazing document.
That's fascinating.
That's the starting point. The probate records of New Brunswick sound pretty dull, but there were about a dozen Black Loyalists that actually had enough property to will. Sadly, there were White Loyalists that bequeathed their slaves to their children. So we have. That's one way of tracking those who were enslaved that came to New Brunswick. Christening records usually distinguish whether a child was black or white,
right.
And that's one way to note someone. In fact, those four sources enabled me to piece together the story of a very quiet Black Loyalist and his wife. In going through the probate records, I discovered that a man named James Peters was deciding how his enslaved blacks should be given out to his family, and he mentions his slave woman Cairo and her free husband, whose name was Pompey Rumsey. Well, there I had two names, so I thought, oh, this is interesting. So I went to the Book of Negroes and found the ship that they came on. Mm-hmm. Sure enough, found that Cairo was an enslaved woman, and that Pompey was a free man when he came to New Brunswick. Then I looked and found that in the correspondence of Sir Guy Carleton, who was the British commander in New York City, in his correspondence there is a letter written by James Peters, the White Loyalist who enslaved Cairo, and he's asking Carleton, would you let Pompey Rumsey come to New Brunswick with his enslaved wife. And so what we find out is that Pompey Rumsey was actually an employee of the British commander. I mean, this is the highest ranking person in all of New York City, and this is who Pompey Rumsey worked for. And at some point in time, Pompey met Cairo, and although he was free and she was enslaved, they got married. Pompey was given that passport by Sir Guy Carleton and came to New Brunswick. So we have a probate record that leads us to the Book of Negroes, that leads us to the correspondence of the British commander in New York City. And in the will of James Peters, the will is written 23 years later after Pompey and Cairo have been in New Brunswick, and you kind of wonder, well, how did that marriage work out?
Yeah.
And the wonderful thing is that, you know, within the probate record, within the will, we find out they're still married. You know, 23 years later, Pompey has stuck by Cairo. He had the opportunity to go to Sierra Leone. He didn't, because he was attached to Cairo for whatever reason. He did not. There seems to be no record of him acquiring land. So he really gave it all up for Cairo.
Well, it sounds like Pompey was a stand-up guy.
Yeah, and the last that we hear of them is in the christening records, the baptismal records for St. John's Anglican Church in Gagetown, and we find out that two Black Loyalist neighbors of the Rumseys named their children for Pompey and for Cairo. So there must have been something about them, you know, unnoteworthy in all other ways. There must have been something in their character that made their neighbors want to name their children for them.
Yeah, no doubt.
As far as we know, that they had no children of their own. We come across no records. But for another generation, there was a Pompey and there was a Cairo in New Brunswick.
Stephen, you mentioned Pompey and Cairo, particularly Cairo, and that's the first that we're hearing about a Black Loyalist woman. How difficult was it compared to the men to find stories on Black Loyalist women? Oh,
really difficult. You know, I've been searching the last 15 years trying to find more stories of Black Loyalists, and when it comes to women, it's a brief reference in a newspaper about how old they were when they died. There were only two Black Loyalist women that had wills that are registered with the probate records. It's very hard to find the Black Loyalist woman's voice. So you have to rely on documents kept, you know, by the white Loyalist establishment. So again, you have to be infamous to find your way into the history books, which is what happened with Nancy Mosley. She was accused of the very first murder in New Brunswick. Her husband was found in South End St. John in 1784, and he had been killed by a fork worth 6 pence. Two Black Loyalists check in on her husband to see why they haven't seen him over the last few days, and when they find him murdered, they report it to the authorities. And Nancy is arrested in October of that year. A grand jury is called to see if there's enough evidence to warrant having a trial. A coroner is brought in to examine the body, and sure enough, Nancy is put on trial, but she's kept in jail at Fort Howe until February of 1785, and she's part of the very first Supreme Court sessions in New Brunswick. And the trial doesn't take very long. She's convicted of manslaughter. They recognize that if she killed him by repeated blows with a fork, that this was not premeditated. It was a crime of passion.
Yeah. The
problem is, in St. John, whether you were white or black, if you stole, you could be hanged. So it's not looking really good for Nancy. She has killed her husband. She is a woman, and she's a black woman. So it's not looking good for her. Fortunately, because this was the first murder trial in what became New Brunswick, it was considered worthy of writing up. And so a 1907 book about the judges of New Brunswick tells this story. So because it's a first, because it's somewhat sensational,
Right.
We have this story. Nancy benefited from someone in the courtroom. Someone came forward and gave her an idea of how she could avoid being hanged. There's a very strange English law that says that if you are a clergyman, you will not suffer the same consequences as an ordinary criminal. Now, Nancy Mosley was certainly not a clergyman, but what was known in legal terms as the benefit of clergy meant that if you could read, you were considered on the same status as a clergyman.
Okay.
And you would not be hanged for murder. You would be branded instead, branded on the thumb. And okay, well, clearly Nancy Mosley is not a clergyman,
right?
But and what often happened was that people could just memorize scripture. You could open up, anywhere in the Bible, and if you could recite the 23rd Psalm or something, you would get this benefit of clergy. So she went for it, and we don't have the details on whether she, had memorized it or had read it, but she received the benefit of clergy, and so in the courtroom, she had her thumb branded with the letter M for murderer, and was set free. Within 4 years of that case, no longer would New Brunswick courts allow the benefit of clergy. So Nancy, was set free. She avoided, the dire consequences, and we only have her story because of the fact that it was that first murder case. Again, she vanishes. We don't know where she went afterwards, if she stayed in St. John, if she went upriver. We just don't know. That's
a fascinating story. Stephen, just out of curiosity, she's a Black Loyalist woman. So does that mean she was born in the States, or was she actually born in New Brunswick?
Oh no, she and her husband came. We're not sure exactly on what ship they came, but we know that they were here with the majority of Loyalists arriving in St. John because their names are found in the victualling musters, and these were a list of records that were kept at Fort Howe.
Yeah.
Fort Howe was not only a garrison for the British, it was also a distribution center for the refugees. So, if you imagine the United Nations High Commission for Refugees providing food, in refugee camps around the world, Fort Howe is basically the equivalent of that. The British distributed food and provisions to Loyalists from Fort Howe.
From Fort Howe, right.
We know that Nancy and her husband were among those who received that aid from Fort Howe.
I got you. It's like a staging center for supplies. Totally understood.
Yeah.
Stephen, we're getting a lot of great questions from the audience, and I just want to tell everybody that's listening. First off, I want to thank everybody for tuning in to our talk today with Stephen. This is fascinating information. So what we're going to do is we're going to take your questions, and Stephen's going to be returning on this Friday at 11 a.m. to talk about 3 New Brunswickers, Black Loyalists, who decided to leave New Brunswick for Sierra Leone. What we're going to do is we're going to take your questions from today, and Stephen is going to answer those questions on Friday. So I want to thank you again, Jennifer, Aaliyah, Graham, and I want to thank you for posting, and we're going to get those questions answered on Friday. So keep listening, stay tuned. Stephen, we know that life was really, it was a struggle for a lot of Black Loyalists, for all the Black Loyalists, really. One of the biographies in your book talks about Edward Burr. Kind of a brutal struggle for him. How did he manage to deal with the racism in New Brunswick at the time?
Yeah, he is interesting. He's one of the very few Black Loyalists that is able to overcome the systemic racism that existed. St. John, in its charter in 1784, was written right into the charter, was the fact that blacks could not work or live within St. John. So you don't get any more blatantly racist than that.
Right.
And yet we find that by 1793. Edward Burr is the gravedigger in St. John, New Brunswick, and he obviously was able to get a special license from the city's mayor to do that, because that was the only way you could live or work in St. John if you were a Black Loyalist. So he becomes a gravedigger, and obviously that's not a job that is going to be popular, that everyone's going to want to do. So the establishment is quite willing to have a Black Loyalist do that.
Sure.
But he has a second income, a second occupation, and this is what makes him a favorite in St. John in the highest social circles. Burr plays the fiddle, and so he becomes the Loyalist era's equivalent of a DJ. It's not going to be a good party unless Burr is there fiddling. And he ends up owning a house in what is now the South End, just below Queen Square.
Right.
He has a will that bequeaths furniture and property in that part of the city. The witnesses and executors in his will are all prominent white St. Johners. So it seems that due to his fiddling, Burr, who is known as Old Ned, amongst the white loyalists that hired him, he was able to enter into white loyalist society, providing an unpopular job in the daytime, grave digging, and being very much in demand in the evening as a fiddler. So the combined incomes gave him income that was extremely rare for Black Loyalists in St. John at the time.
That's fascinating. That is fascinating. And it's funny with that breakdown. He's doing an undesirable job, but he's also so during the day he's not wanted around, but when it comes to entertaining, he's definitely wanted around. So you almost see the pattern for social life in North America, going forward for the next 200 years. I'm reminded of the Cotton Club in New York City in the 1930s, where Blacks could definitely entertain, but they couldn't interact with the white customers.
Exactly. Yeah. So it started, sadly, very early in St. John's history.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Stephen, this is I'm just loving your information here, what you're sharing with us. I got one more question for you for today. So we know that when New Brunswick's white loyalists were often disheartened by difficulties or of looking for greater prosperity, they returned to homes in the United States, or they migrated to Ontario. They had options, right, because they were white loyalists. Mm-hmm. What alternatives did New Brunswick's Black loyalists have in the face of so many challenges due to racism?
Yeah, sadly, between 1783 and 1791, they've got absolutely no alternatives to having to live with it in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Thomas Peters in Nova Scotia got so frustrated with what's going on there, the injustice in Nova Scotia, he crossed the Bay of Fundy to New Brunswick and hoped that things would be better. They weren't. Mm-hmm. So there's this absolute frustration. However, Thomas Peters, very determined guy, he doesn't give up. He decides, okay, I'm going to go to England and get this straightened out. Right. And he risks being recaptured and re-enslaved by boarding a ship and going to England. And that's what would have happened to any Black loyalist. If they decided to return to the United States, they would be re-enslaved. So they were between a rock and a hard place. They were in a colony that was not giving them all the privileges of British citizenship, but there was nowhere to go. However, when Peters returns from his time in England, he comes back with an option that no one saw coming. The British government is willing to pay for the transportation and setting up of a free Black Christian colony in West Africa in Sierra Leone. And it's all at the expense of the British government. So this is an amazing opportunity. And when the British make this opportunity known, the assumption is that only a few hundred folk will take advantage of it. Right. Well, Peters comes back to New Brunswick, goes up the St. John River and tells people about this. The news spreads through Nova Scotia, and within a matter of months, there are over 200 people from New Brunswick who are more than anxious to go to Sierra Leone and found that colony. There were limitations. If you were enslaved, you couldn't leave New Brunswick. If you were an indentured servant, you had to fulfill your time with your employer. So you had to be free and free of debt to take advantage of that. And then when people wanted to leave, the whites in power did their best to try to stop them from leaving New Brunswick. They would come up with false indentures. They would come up with false debts. They didn't want to lose an inexpensive source of labor.
Sure.
So even getting out of the province, out of the colony, was difficult for Black Loyalists. But we know that about 222 were able to board ships in St. John to head for Halifax and eventually go on to Sierra Leone. And that's something we'll talk about more on Friday.
That's fascinating. It just sounds like, life on either side of the border was treacherous for blacks, whether they're in the new United States or in maritime Canada. Really fascinating information. And I know, and I'm gonna tease something that you're probably going to talk about on Friday. I know for a fact that one of those Black Loyalists managed to walk from the St. John region, I believe the Grand Bay region, to Halifax in order to board a boat for Sierra Leone, and that's going to be a great story that we're looking forward to hearing from you on Friday.
Good,
Stephen. Listen, I want to thank you. I want to thank you again for sharing this information on these Black Loyalists with us. I learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience did. I've really enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to hearing the continuation. On Friday at 11 a.m., Stephen will be back talking about 3 Black Loyalists who decided to leave New Brunswick to begin life again in Sierra Leone. So on behalf of StephenDavidson, our guest today, and Prude and the speaker series, I want to thank you all for tuning in and remind you to join us later today when we'll have Peter Little at 2 o'clock today, 2 p.m., speaking about Canada's first Black lawyer, Abraham Beverly Walker. And tomorrow we're going to be having historian Graham Nickerson, talking about the world of the Black Atlantic world of the late 18th and early 19th century, which includes Black Loyalists and Black refugees. And then once again, tune in on Friday at 11 a.m. when we will speak again to StephenDavidson, who will talk to us more about Black Loyalists, this time Black Loyalists who left New Brunswick. Thank you very much. Cheers.